It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Janet Dorozynski. Janet is the Global Practice Lead for Canadian Wine, Spirits and Beer at Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada. She's responsible for establishing and coordinating a program which assists Canadian embassies to serve and promote Canadian wine throughout the world. And she works closely with the wine and beverage alcohol industries on developing and coordinating international market development strategies. Previously to this position, Janet received her doctorate in social demography from Concordia University in Montreal. There she taught public policy and government business relations for 5 years. Since that time, Janet has worked in various capacities in the Canadian and international wine industries with Wines of South Africa and Stellenbosch, Wine Television, the LCBO of Ontario, or the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, the LCBO, sorry, and also as Director of Research and Government Relations for the Canadian Vintners Association, the CVA. Janet's also completed numerous enology and sommelier courses around the world. She's been a contributor to Wines magazine articles for many years. She's been judging wine at competitions in Canada, the US, the UK, Argentina for over a decade now. She's taught in programs at both Algonquin College and Niagara College. So she's a very busy individual. We're very fortunate that Janet is one of our CCOVI professional affiliates with the Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute here at Brock. And recently, we recognized Janet for her contribution to the wine and grape industry in the education and promotion of Canadian wines. I also want to make a point to mention that Janet is the chair of the advisory committee for the Governor General's Award in celebration of the Nation's Table, a national award recognizing excellence and innovation in the field of Canadian food and wine. So today, Janet's going to share some of her research and experience regarding Canadian wine exports. So with that, Janet, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Debbie. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming out today. I guess just to follow up a little bit about what Debbie said, I'm going to give you a little bit more of the background of what informs my lecture for today, and also wanted to say that while I do work for the Government of Canada, Foreign Affairs and International Trade, any views I express in this presentation are mine and do not reflect that of the department or the wine industry. I've been working with the wine industry in this current position for about, so it's going on 7 years now, and we've developed a long-term export strategy, and now we're in the implementation phase of this export strategy. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is based on what we've seen happening during the implementation phase of the strategy and what we've been learning from some of the trade and sommeliers and buyers that we've brought into Canada. And I think you'll find some of the observations quite interesting. So that's the structure of the presentation. Basically, even though I think we as Canadians, and especially in a place like this, know we have a wine industry, we tend to think that the rest of the world knows a lot about our wines and our industry, when in fact they really don't know that much. We don't export a lot in comparison to other wine-producing countries. In terms of production, we're number 32 or 34 right now in the world, so quite small. But we're not really out there internationally in the network for exports, or even in terms of, for those of you who may have been at the wine sales and profitability seminar yesterday at Niagara College and heard Anthony Gismondi and David Lorison speaking about sort of how the media has been responding to what the Canadian wine industry has been doing with them in terms of, getting their products out across. Basically, Anthony Gismondi said internationally nobody even knows that Canada, what we're doing, or that we even exist, and we're not known internationally. And he based this on you know, he travels extensively, and throughout the past 20 years, having gone to hundreds of wine regions, he said the first question that people often say to him is, "Really, Canada, you make wine? What are you guys doing there? We don't know anything about you. We don't hear anything about you." And that's sort of similar to what we've been experiencing with the trade that we've been interacting with in the few key markets that we've been working on. I'd like to contrast, and I'll get into that further on, I'd like to contrast this with sort of how we see ourselves and what we're saying, and I started looking at sort of websites on Canadian wine, industry associations, government websites, etc., and what they're saying about our industry, and we're always referred to as making world-class wines, and we're recognized internationally. If we look at the Grape Grower of Ontario's website and look at their sort of vision statement, it says, "Our vision is to see the markets for Ontario grapes and wines expand domestically and internationally on a continuous basis, always finding new markets for our products. Ontario-grown grape products will be demanded at home and recognized internationally." Going ahead, if we look at sort of some information on Ontario government websites, I'll read you another quote which I found quite interesting. And this is Sofia Agelionitas, Minister of Consumer Services. She says, "We continue to work with our wine and grape industry to build on the successes of our VQA wines here at home and on the international stage. Our long-term vision is a wine and grape industry that is increasingly competitive and successful, offering products that are recognized across Canada and around the world." So there's very much an emphasis on looking at what we're doing domestically, or conveying the message that we are doing something domestically as well as internationally, and people like to make a lot of that fact. With the exception of sort of a few ventures into the export market, I'd say that the bulk of the activity of the wine industry is focused largely on entering international wine competitions. And as you all know, we've won a fair amount of awards at wine competitions. But one of the things that strikes me about this is that a lot of the wine competitions, like very famous wine competitions, International Wine and Spirits Award, Decanter World Wine Awards, where Canadian wineries are entering more and more, I'm not sure if the producers here are aware, or industry at large is aware, that when our wines are in those competitions, they're actually judged against one another. So producers are sending wine over to England, and all the panels, in the case of Decanter, it's mostly Canadians. In the case of International Wine and Spirits, there are more foreigners. But Canadian wines are judged against Canadian wines. And when I started thinking about that, I thought, well, that's not really giving us any barometer or gauge of where we are internationally and how we fare against other, you know, Cabernet Sauvignon, Riesling, or whatever in the world, because we're just being compared amongst ourselves. So, in terms of export, as I said, the department has been working with industry, and industry itself, even predating me, has been working on sort of doing some export initiatives. And I guess the question which I am often posed, or which often comes up, is why would we export anyway, given our small size and where we are right now? I would argue that by exporting, we get the international recognition that actually contributes to building our brand domestically. It helps us to be more competitive in terms of the industry domestically, because we have more of a perspective of what the rest of the world is doing and what kind of wines are being produced out there. Many other, I think, well, people know, maybe they don't remember, but I think a lot of other great wine growing regions have actually used export to increase the reputation of their wines. New Zealand is the most obvious and famous example of this, but I started to think about how even regions like Bordeaux for first growth Bordeaux's or Burgundies, I mean, a lot of the lesser wines stay in those appellations, but those wines wouldn't be anything or as sought after as they are if they weren't exported and people throughout the world were trying to get their hands on these wines. So I think it's really had an impact on creating a reputation for the appellation and those kind of wines, because until very recently, I think, until sort of the New World invasion, a lot of people still, because they knew about first growth Bordeaux and Grand Cru Burgundy, consumers who are buying entry-level wines would think, oh yeah, I'm going to buy Burgundy and Bordeaux because it's such a famous region and their wines are so great. So I think that's something that we can think about as well. I would also add that a lot of the world's great wine regions have also suffered when they've stopped exporting. And if we look at the example of South Africa under apartheid, where their wine industry was completely, well, for all extents and purposes, not exporting and cut off from the rest of the world, the quality of the grapes and wines completely went downhill. The industry suffered. They went through a period of not having any outside exposure, any feedback. I mean, yes, there were a few wineries who got out and people would bring in wines in their suitcases, but by and large, it really had a negative impact on their industry. And when they, with the demise of apartheid, it was sort of like, and that's actually when I worked in South Africa shortly after that, you saw that the industry was basically starting over again because they had been shut off from the world and all this feedback and critical sort of feedback that you get when you're exporting and out there internationally. I think the same can be said for Tokai, another famous sweet wine. If we look at what happened pre-communist takeover in Hungary, and after the revolution, basically the quality of grapes, production, everything about Tokai took a nosedive for that 30, 40-year period. A lot of the wines were shipped off, the quality went down, they were shipped off to Russia in exchange for oil and petroleum products and auto parts and whatever, and so there was no incentive to have this drive towards quality and continuing to make them these world-class wines that they always were. Other reasons I think export is important even for small industries is that it can provide sort of an alternative distribution channel, sales channel, diversification, which can provide sort of longer-term sustainability. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the recent study by Anil Hira from Simon Fraser University about the BC wine industry, and in it, I mean, he talks about a lot of things. I encourage you to look at it. But he talks about sort of the vulnerable situation of the BC wine industry, and part of that reason is because they have such a heavy reliance on domestic markets, a lack of alternative sales channel outside the LDB and cellar door, and there's a very low engagement in export, and he sort of signals that in the long term this could pose problems for the industry. Here in Ontario and in Canada, I would say in general, we tend to say, okay, well, we have to sort of wait till we're ready in terms of, or that we've conquered the domestic market, and now we want to spend time focusing on wine tourism, which I think is a great thing. It's a growing field. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that wine tourism and exports can be mutually reinforcing or mutually exclusive. An international reputation for our wines will actually make people want, and if our wines are out there and available somewhere, people will actually want to come to Canada and try more of the wines on site. Alternatively, I think that wine tourism, and to some extent it already has, it can work against the development of the industry, because what you have happening with wine tourism is, whether it's a busload of people, a carload of people, or just sort of your average consumers, I think a lot of wineries tend to think, well, I have to make something for everyone because I want to sell all kinds of wine to anyone who's going to come in our door. And I think what that, and you see that in Niagara and other wine regions, is that small, medium-sized wineries who really don't have the capacity or capability are making, 50 different kinds of wine. They're not really focusing on sort of grape varieties that they probably should, because we do best. So it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. We also, in terms of exporting, and I'll go into it a bit later, we have a lot of ice wine in Canada, and we're not selling it here, and we're actually not selling it as much internationally as we used to. So that's something something that we should look about when, or why we're considering export. As I said earlier, I'm not even following the poem. Anyway, this is all on the CCOVI website. So Many would argue that Canada should not export until we own our own domestic market. I think that this is a problematic argument or reasoning for several reasons. One, because yes, okay, if we own the domestic market and sell everything that we produce here, there will be no need to export, but it still doesn't address the reason of how are we going to get known internationally and how are people ever going to know about our wine industry outside of our borders. Just selling in the domestic market doesn't prepare wineries to export. They're not familiar with what's going on in the world at large, how the global wine industry operates, because even though I know wineries don't like the LCBO that much, complain a lot about the LCBO, once you get a listing there, it is sort of relatively easy because you're dealing with one supplier who pays within 30 days, so it's quite easy. You're not sort of out there exporting, dealing with multiple distributors and multiple sales channels. I would also say that, you know, we don't have to wait until we own the domestic market and put export on hold. I think we can do both simultaneously, and there are lots of countries that have done that as well. And even, you know, one of my things is now anytime I go to a wine show or anywhere where there are producers from anywhere in the world, and I sort of zone in on the wineries that are making between 20 and 40,000 cases a year. And I mean, I usually see them at shows where they're out there, so that means they're exporting. So I ask them, you know, why at your size are you exporting, and how much of your production do you allocate? And all of them basically the same. I mean, the percentage of allocation varies, but they all basically say the same thing, because we want to be known, we want the world to know that, you know, our winery makes these wines, that our region makes these wines, that our country makes these wines, and the only way you're going to do that if the wines are leaving the country. You can't rely only on people to come to your country. So, and even a lot of these smaller wineries are, you know, they're very focused. They say we've allocated 10 or 15% of our production, and that's what we do, and we choose these markets in Canada or elsewhere because for these reasons, and they're very strategic about it. So I would also say that in terms of export, I think that the lure of the domestic market and the incentives to sell domestically have actually worked against the Canadian industry from exporting, and it prevents us from looking at export seriously. And by what I mean by that is that both Ontario and BC governments, in an attempt to support their industry, have had programs which actually incent and encourage VQA producers to sell their products through liquor boards. The BC government has had a program called the Quality Enhancement Program, QEP, which has been around for, I don't know, a long time, and it's to incent small and medium-sized, any winery that produces VQA wine to sell through the BC liquor distribution system. And Ontario has had a similar program as well. We had it for a couple of years ago, and then it was relaunched last year under the name of the VQA Wine Support Program, in which the government has committed $6 million per year over 5 years. And this is to encourage the sale of VQA table wines through the LCBO. So not surprisingly, since this program was reintroduced, there are a lot more wineries who are interested in selling through the LCBO, Ontario wineries. And VQA sales at the LCBO, which were rising, are rising even more, and VQA white wines are now the fastest growing category in the LCBO. So in terms of exporting and what we have actually done for exporting, and I'm talking about not we in terms of what I've been doing, but sort of what's been happening in the Canadian industry. We've basically only been exporting for about, well, going on 20 years now, since about the 1990s. Prior to that, the domestic industry in the wine market in Canada, prior to the free trade agreement with the United States in 1988, was actually quite protected. There was no incentive to look for markets or do anything, and our wines and wine sales in Canada were protected. Under the terms and conditions of the first free trade agreement, those rights to the market were given up But in exchange, the industry, I'm sure you guys all know this, got back sort of incentives to pull out some of the old Labrusca and hybrid vines and plant Vitis vinifera in order to make the industry more competitive that way, which has basically been responsible for the creation of the modern wine industry in Canada. When we did start exporting in the 90s, it was focused on ice wine, and you know, we were producing a decent amount of ice wine at the time, but because we weren't really known for any other kind of wine, but because we were known for being cold and snowy and sort of not the things that come to mind for a wine region, the opportunity to promote and export out ice wine was, I guess, sort of a natural. It was also coming at a time when Germany and Austria were the two other large producers of ice wine in the world. Their reputation as a wine industry or wine producing regions were suffering at the time. Germany in that sort of the 80s, 90s, and it's, you know, now sort of recovered, but, you know, they had gone through this period of all this cheap, bulk, sweet wine, Liebfraumilch and all this kind of stuff. So even their ice wine and the reputation of German wines had been sort of thrown into that camp. So it was something that we could seize upon. And Austria, similarly, which is an ice wine producer then and now, had their antifreeze scandal, which, I mean, no one really ever, I mean, it's still under debate whether people actually did put antifreeze in the wines and to what extent the problem was. Austria, yes, in 1985. So that was something that was very damaging to the Austrian wine industry at the time, so another reason. And what we were seeing in Canada at the time was that ice wine, when it was being made, was very popular with the tour buses of Japanese, mostly Japanese tourists at the time who were passing through Niagara to go to Niagara Falls. So Enniskillen, which was basically the leader and the first person to really do this on any scale internationally, had decided to globalize the brand, and in order to do so, well, their approach was to go through a duty-free sales channel in Asia, Japan and around, so that Japanese tourists who liked the wine here could buy the wine on their way back, and eventually there were arrangements made that they could, I don't get it, they went into the duty-paid market as well too. But one of the things that happened with this, and part of the strategy, was that the price of ice wine, which at the time was selling for $30, approximately $30 US in Canada, was raised to $65 US because the margins and the return on the investment in dealing with duty-free operators in Asia, you have to actually, they take a large percentage of what you're selling. So in order to have this to be economically viable, they had to raise the price. So that was where we sort of saw a huge jump in the price of ice wine. A result of what we saw happening with Enniskillen is it was popular here, it became very popular overseas. A lot of other ice wine producers in Canada thought, oh, okay, I can do this too. So more people started making ice wine. And the result of that was that these people didn't have the same support system in place, they didn't have the network, they didn't have the international distribution to actually sell the ice wine like Enniskillen did. So what it actually did was cause sort of a downward pressure on pricing. A lot of producers who were not able to sell their product as easily as Enniskillen ended up, due to oversupply, ended up slashing the price of ice wine. One of the things, and this is some of this information comes from, there's a Harvard Business School case study, and it's on the globalization of ice wine, and some of the observations in there, which I think are interesting for our industry to look at, is that Roger Provost, who used to be the chief marketing officer for Vingor International and was basically the sort of person who orchestrated this strategy for the globalization of ice wine, when he saw that there were all these new entrants coming in, leading to an oversupply and sort of, price slashing, he sort of looked at this and thought, okay, well, and he came from, or had worked in the cognac industry, and one of the things he noticed that was when he was working with cognac, that the French sort of regulatory body, sort of appellation system similar to VQA Ontario, actually not only regulated quality and all the things that VQA regulates here, vintage and truth and labeling, but they also regulated production. And one of the reasons they did that was so that cognac, and especially high-end cognac, would always remain scarce and an in-demand product. VQA Ontario doesn't have the authority or the jurisdiction to do that with ice wine, so that's part of the reason why people could start planting and making more ice wine, and we saw this sort of increase in production and downward pricing. Another thing that we saw and continues to this day is that imitation, which is the best form of flattery, not really for ice wine, but it basically spawned this whole industry in Asia for fake ice wine production, which is either made from products that have nothing to do with ice wine, sometimes not even wine, and there's also part of the issue is that there is ice wine that's exported in bulk from Canada, which is then rebottled and packaged as ice wine, which is not entitled to be called ice wine if it's in a container over 2 liters in Asia. So, and I thought it was interesting to observe what Roger Provost said, that, with all the new entrants and price slashing and what should Inniskillen do, and what it would be more profitable to actually produce 10 bottles of table wine, which was the equivalent to one bottle of ice wine, and sort of focus and do that. And I think over the past decade we've started to see more and more people think about that, and about whether or not, has ice wine seen its day, is it a fad? Or is it a matter that we need to actually create more demand, or actually find the markets where the ice wine drinkers are? We continue to this day to be a large producer of ice wine. In 2010, over, I think, 1 million liters of ice wine, up from 33,000 liters in 1993. Production is up both in Ontario and British Columbia this year, and the amounts are increasing in Nova Scotia and Quebec as well, even though Nova Scotia has an appellation system, Quebec doesn't, but they're not entitled to call themselves ice wine like VQA ice wine, but it is ice wine to some extent. What we've also seen happening within the industry is there is this sort of growing movement to move away from the focus on ice wine and whether or not ice wine is and should be our flagship product. What this is, and this is, we look at sort of the seriously cool Chardonnay tastings that have been happening here and overseas, and will happen in New York next week. There are more and more producers, both in Ontario and British Columbia, who want to focus on ice wine, don't want to lead, focus on table wine, don't want to lead with ice wine, and really sort of downplay the fact that they can make ice wine. I think one of the, it's fine to have that as a business strategy, but I think one of the things that it's done to the industry as a whole is it's contributed to mixed messaging on our part, because people now, those in the trade who do know us, they're not really sure what we are anymore. Are we ice wine? Are we table wine? Are we high value table wine? Are we, lower price point table wine? Are we cellar in Canada wine? I mean, we're all those things. And I think we sort of grapple with all these things domestically as an industry, not just internationally, but it would probably be better if we could try to sort some of these things out domestically so that we don't have to grapple with them internationally as well. There was also a thinking, and I remember hearing it when I first entered the government, that ice wine would be used to create a pull-through opportunity for table wine. What we're actually finding is that this is not true. The way that ice wine was positioned, being very rare and scarce and expensive, That's not actually the way that we can position our table wines from a region that is unknown and nobody knows our wines. So it's not actually valid that it's, you know, it will create an opportunity. Table wine is not a brand extension of ice wine and requires a different sort of export and market entry strategy. In Canada right now, we currently have about 50 wineries that are exporting in various sort of way, shape, or form. Of that 50, I'd say we probably have about 20 who are committed to export and who are doing it year in, year out. Of the other 30, sometimes they're in, sometimes they're not. What I see more and more now is people who are exporting ice wine, in particular to Asia. And I think because we have sort of more people dabbling or getting into it, that's part of the reason why we see that exports have actually gone up after a period of sort of dipping for a while. They've reached record levels, and these are figures for year-end 2010. Almost 15 million liters and $28 million in total, which is still very small if you look at exports from other parts of the world. But the interesting thing in this, and up until several years ago, we never had a breakout of total exports and ice wine, and Agriculture Canada and Statistics Canada now provide that. So it's interesting to look at the total value and volume of wine exports overall with ice wine exports, because it's still, I mean, value-wise, it's still, you know, just under sort of half of the overall amount. But volume-wise, it's a very small percentage of the amount that we export. But also there's, and this is another thing that needs to be worked on, but, you know, almost 15 million liters, but it includes everything, sparkling ice, fortified, grape must, everything. So there are a lot of things in there. I put this in here because I just wanted you to see the top 10 export markets for Canadian wine by value and volume. Most people tend to think that most of our wine is going to Asia, but in fact it still is the US, like the majority of Canadian exports, period. And sort of the overwhelming majority volume-wise to the US, although value-wise it's right up there with China, and which has a much smaller amount for volume. So that definitely speaks to the fact that there is ice wine, authentic ice wine, going into China, as well as the other markets there that you see. Switzerland, we still think that's a bit of an anomaly in there. We're not really sure why it's in the top 10 and no one can figure it out. But anyway, the rest of the breakdown usually looks like this from year to year. So, okay, so I said that we have been working with industry on a pilot project for the past couple of years, developed an export strategy. I talked about that last year during my presentation, so I won't talk about it now, but it's, in a nutshell, it's basically to look at a few key markets, have a sustained focus in these few key markets, and focus on the trade. It's not a consumer strategy. We decided to do a pilot project in Chicago, and we chose Chicago in the US because it's the third largest market for imports of imported wine in the US. It's not as crowded and overwhelming as New York, and LA, which is LA in the area, which is the second largest market for imports, still tends to have a huge percentage of Californian wines that dominate. So we chose Chicago. We've been conducting a series of inbound visits for distributors, buyers, sommeliers, and media over the past couple of years, so that in order to assess and evaluate the quality and market viability of Ontario and BC wines. As I said, it's joint industry and government supported, and we've also done one in-market event in Chicago last year, but we found out that because there's not really a lot of wine locally available in Chicago, there's only 3 or 4 producers, that it was even difficult to get trade to come out to a trade tasting because there just wasn't enough and it wasn't compelling enough. So. But the original intention of the strategy was always to bring people to Canada, to the wine regions, to have them experience our wine regions and have them see what we do and who we are here. So, and what we did for this pilot project, which was a little different for some of the things that had been done by government prior to that and even industry, is that we hired a consultant, an in-market consultant in Chicago, someone who had been working with the wine industry for 10 or 15 years, and he was the one responsible for reaching out and making sure that we would get all the key sort of buyers and influencers to come. And he would also be responsible for interviewing these people while on the trips to Canada, and also doing exit follow-up interviews with them and writing reports that were then shared with my department and members of the government and individual producers, so that they could actually see what these people who are in positions of buying and listing and distributing wine are saying about Canadian wine. So that's been very useful, I think, probably the most useful thing about the pilot project. So some of the observations, what we've actually learned from this. As I mentioned earlier, we're not widely known within the trade, with the exception of ice wine, but we know that. We have a lack of brand identity, and we have too many conflicting messages. People, when they come here, usually when they come here, they know we make ice wine, but then they come here and we see there's all this table wine, so they're like, okay, what is it? Ice wine, table wine, high quality wine, entry-level wine. We always say we're a cool climate growing region, which is what we are, but yet, and less so in Ontario and more so in BC, but to some extent we see in both places that we're producing all these red grape varieties that are hot, warm grape varieties. So, you know, they always find that a bit funny as a cool climate growing area that we're doing that. They also, and this is sort of repeated observations, that diversity, and what they mean by that is the number of grape varieties and wine styles. They see that diversity for a region, either the regions or Canada as a country that's so small, is not actually a strength, but it demonstrates a lack of focus on our part. And, you know, one of the things that we've heard wineries say is, you know, we're young and we don't know really what's good, and we have to experiment, and, you know, we'll get there. But it's funny because all the trade we brought in, they all come back to the same sort of 4 or 5 different grape varieties when they taste the Riesling, Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir, and Syrah in BC. They all say, you know, these are the wines that you guys do well. The other stuff, you don't even need to grow them. And, you know, and this is not a surprise, because even if you listen to Canadian trade and journalists, I mean, they're always saying the same things. So anyway, I think, you know, it would probably be useful if industry and governments could support a planting strategy. And I know there's attempts to start to do that, but to map out, you know, what we do as opposed to letting producers sort of experiment in the way that they do, or somehow get producers to start thinking that, you know, maybe it's not such a great idea that you're growing Zinfandel, and the reason you're doing this is because you want to be the only one in Canada that's doing it. It's not a compelling enough reason, I don't think. So another thing that we found out is that the wines in general are too expensive to be viable and to sell in external markets. This is, as I said, a lot of this is coming from our pilot project from Chicago, but we've also recently started working with some things in the UK, and we brought over a mission from the UK who actually came to CCOVI and had a nice little talk and overview from Debbie, and they loved it. But both people in the US and the UK and elsewhere, I've heard this before, that our wines are just too expensive, and they're too expensive sort of from a price-quality ratio, and because we're unknown. This is what you hear all the time, we're an unknown region. It's hard, you know, to sell wine when nobody even really knows you make wine. And in very competitive markets like the UK and the US, you know, there are all these kind of wines that Canada makes, the same grape varieties, the same styles, but yet the wines are less expensive. One thing that when we formulated this strategy, and to some extent I think it's still sort of there in people's consciousness, is that, you know, we need to lead with our best, but best always means the highest price reserve wine. What we're learning from the trade and their feedback is that it doesn't necessarily mean that our best wines can be our mid-range wines, which are actually at a better price point or priced more comparatively than the higher price points. So I think that's sort of an interesting lesson that we've learned there too. Again, just to go over a few things, product brand inconsistency, cool climate production challenges, and by that I mean that, you know, some wineries are sort of not really in tune to the market and the kind of wines that they're putting forward, either for tastings when trade come to their properties. We have also had tastings where we did it both in Ontario and BC, where producers who are interested in export but may not quite be there yet, they had the option to submit wine for a tasting, and our people, you know, just would taste through like 40 or 50 wines, and our consultant would write down comments on every wine and the labels and the price and the packaging, and then they would get that feedback whether or not, you know, the wines would make it in the market. So, but that's there, you know, some of the comments were, you know, why would they submit this kind of wine? It's like, you know, it's not a very sort of good wine. And anyway, so it just speaks to, I think, some of the things we need to continue to, industry needs to be mindful of, and we need to continue to work with industry on these things when the government is involved in any of these kinds of things. Almost universal agreement that Canadian wines, whether they're being sold in the US, the UK, even places like Japan, they're, you know, sommelier, wine geek, hand sell kind of wines, and that's part of the reason why we're focusing on trade, is so that we could get the trade excited and get them to be our ambassadors and evangelists and sell the wine. Again, nothing new. Many wineries here, producers, even the ones who are sort of in export, are still a bit unfamiliar with export or where we're actually situated in the global market. They don't really know their audience when they're talking to the trade. They didn't know how to sort of, you know, pitch and which products to present. They, in a lot of the actual winery visits, they were talking to the trade like they were consumers, and they were taking them on tours of their barrel cellar and stuff like that, which trade they could care less. They've seen a million, and, you know, they don't even want to. One thing we found, and we're hearing it more and more, is they don't even want to taste barrel samples, because these guys are in the business of buying, listing, and selling finished wines. It's maybe interesting if, you know, from an experimental point of view, if, you know, someone has an acacia barrel that no one's ever tasted, so you can let them try that, but by and large, they're not that interested in barrel samples. Or if they do taste barrel samples, don't take them to the cellar, just bring the barrel sample and put it behind the finished wine that they're tasting, so they can actually see what the wine is going to look like in the next vintage. Other things, you know, wineries here tend to focus a lot on talking about the awards that they've won, either in Canada or even internationally. The trade could care less. But even, you know, it became even more obvious when you would have wineries sitting there saying, oh yes, this won a silver at the Ontario Wine Awards, and these guys don't even know what the Ontario Wine Awards are. So, I mean, I can understand how it's great to be proud, but I think you just have to remember who your audience is and sort of pitch accordingly. And one of the things that I think is a bit problematic too is that a lot of the, or not a lot, but some of the wineries that we were working with who have been part of these missions and submitted wines, and the ones who have actually had interest from distributors or buyers, they haven't followed up. So all I can say to that is, what's up with that? You know, it's sort of, and it's not something that's so unusual for the wine industry. There are other industries in Canada, comprised of small, medium-sized producers that, you know, there's not a habit of following up. So I think what we have to do for export is that we have to, wineries and producers have to think like a sommelier, not a marketer, and By that I mean, you know, when you're a marketer and you're marketing sort of high volume wines with low costs and price points, or if you're willing to switch up what you make and make it suited to the market, like the Australians are so brilliant in doing, then you can, you know, go full out, be a marketing machine and do it. But we don't have that capability. That's not who we are. So I think we have to try to really get inside the head of a sommelier and figure out, you know, what kind of wines, and show them these kind of wines. I'm not saying we have to only make these kind of wines, because there's a place for other wines that we might make domestically or elsewhere. But for export, I think that's the approach that that we have to use. I think also an interesting thing that we've learned too is this whole concept, and this is our consultant in Chicago, and when he first started talking to me about it 3 years ago, I'm like, yeah, let's, like, you know, get on with things and kind of do some business. But he kept saying, you know, this whole thing about goodwill, when you bring people to your wine region and your country, it's about, you know, sort of, they've never been here before, they don't know anything about Canada, they usually have a positive association about Canada. But I don't think we can expect them to immediately go back and, you know, either list your wine or take you on as a distributor after having been here for a 2 or 3 day visit. You need to follow up by the producers themselves. You need some follow-up, you know, on the part of government and others in the market. But it's all about sort of creating goodwill, and it's a long-term process. It just doesn't happen from one visit. And this last passage here is a quote from him, where he said, a vital component of creative ambassadors and evangelists for a reason and our industry is to provide them with an opportunity to get to know producers, the people, and the country. Avoid subjecting guests to poor presentations or to be placed in an uncomfortable position of having to interact with producers whose wines are of questionable or poor quality. Sounds simple, but not always obvious. With regard to ice wine, our flagship, I threw this in here as a sort of separate slide and separate thing because we've been seeing some interesting things and having some interesting feedback on ice wine, which relates to some of the things that I said earlier. One, both in the UK and the US market, they are good wines, good markets for sweet wine, but they're very crowded markets, they're very price competitive markets. That's what we heard all the time from the people who came here. Our ice wine is not that competitively priced, apparently, and especially in the UK. So a lot of the UK buyers who were here about a month ago kept saying, you know, we really like a lot of this ice wine. We would buy it and list it and sell it, but the price just, you know, it's more expensive than Austria and German ice wine. And, you know, that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, so that they can either sell it by the bottle or sell it by the glass. They also noted, and you know, it's sort of when you hear it from the outside and kind of, you know, you see it and you think it, or but until someone else says it, they say, you know, we have very conflicting messaging around ice wine, because every single producer you talk to says that, you know, it's highly value added, it's expensive to produce, it's a risky business, it's scarce, da 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 da. But then they said you see it everywhere, more so in Niagara than when we were in BC, but it's in everything: cocktails, chocolates, vinegar, jams, marinades, cooking. So, you know, and they kept asking me, how can this be? And I said, oh, talk to the producers. I can't answer that question. So anyway, I thought it was an interesting observation, which I've shared with industry, and I know a lot of them were sort of sitting there scratching their heads and thinking, yeah, maybe there's a bit of inconsistency in this message, that if it's precious and rare, it can't be ubiquitous. So I also wanted to include some of the direct quotes from the producers themselves, but I'm not going to go through and read them because they're in the presentation. You can sort of look at them. I mean, they speak to some of the things that I've been talking about, you know, sort of what are we, what should we focus on, what do we want to be when we grow up, and what are we now. So I think they're just interesting observations. And also, again, the one, you know, the mid-range wines were found to be more interesting than some of the higher-end wines. both in terms of price point and what they actually were. A lot of them, and I heard this, that a lot of the high-end reserve wines they felt were more wines that were made in the winery than in the vineyard, and so that was something to take into consideration as well. And again, the last quote here about ice wine and the pricing being relatively or comparatively expensive compared to Germany and Austria, where Germany and Austria actually produce less and less often than in Canada, and in a market like the UK, Austrian ice wine, and even sometimes German, tends to be, you know, a lot cheaper than Canadian ice wine. So that was a bit of a sort of quandary for them. And I like again, the thing about, you know, what, on the one hand it's rare, on the other hand you find it in almost anything: jam, chocolate, cocktails, pastry, cooking. This devaluates the product and speaks of glut. These are people whose first language is not English. I would rather be able to sell it by the glass in the restaurant. The cost would need to be on the right side of £20 for a 375 ml bottle than desecrated in a cocktail. Price-wise, it's almost like using Dom Perignon as an ingredient. So I think what that says is they see sort of that it is this precious product and comparable to something like, you know, a very high-end champagne, but I think we have to be a bit more conscious of what we're doing with this product to preserve and guard that reputation. So just to sort of finish off here, you know, learning from the best, I think there are different kinds of export and sales strategy and what they're based on. We can have a differentiation strategy which focuses on the special characteristics of a region, premium price point, and limited market share. Examples of this: New Zealand for Sauvignon Blanc, or all their wines now actually, in other ones they've branched out into, in Oregon for Pinot Noir. New York State is starting to do this for Riesling. Austria has done this for Wiener Veltliner. Uruguay is even doing this for Tannat in the UK market. Or you can go with a cost leadership strategy, which is high volume, low cost, large market share, and that obvious example is Australia, Chile, Argentina for Malbec and other wines. The worst case scenario would be either not have, when you don't have a cost advantage or any distinctive value, and that's kind of where we're sitting right now. It's not that I think there's lots that we can do, and it's a very exciting time to figure out how we can do it, but we're kind of, you know, as I've said, and what we've been seeing is we don't know who we are and what we're actually doing. So, and I think, you know, one of the things we've seen in looking at other exporting countries is the best practices for export usually include a strong centralized leadership through an national industry association for, you know, strategic direction, planning, and execution. And great examples of this are New Zealand, Austria, and California. So what next? I think we need to continue export training for those who are interested. I don't think there are any producers in the audience here, but we're having another export training seminar on March 24th in Niagara. So if you're interested, I think the information was sent to Covey, or you can contact me. We need to work on improving coordination for export activities and the planning and the execution, because there's still sort of a lot of people involved and not, I don't think, always the most efficient way of going about it. I think now we have to start looking at a re-examination of the product mix and markets. You know, maybe we need to focus all our attention for ice wine on markets in Asia where there is sort of more of an opportunity right now. Maybe, I mean, we can continue and producers can continue to sell in the UK and the US, but I think what we're starting to see is, you know, the markets aren't sustaining that price point anymore. I think we really have to look at tailoring our activities to support sort of, you know, really great international exposure and brand recognition amongst really key influencers, and go for the A-list all the time and not waste any time on, you know, people who bringing them here or having them taste our wines. Not to, I mean, I think we have to be a bit more mercenary. In the past, I think maybe we've been too nice and too Canadian and think, okay, well, this person wants to come, aren't we lucky? Someone is paying attention to us, so yeah, let's spend our money and bring them over. Whereas, we have to go after the big fish and get them. We also have to have more producers collaborating in a few key markets. That also speaks to getting people to agree on a few key markets, which is easier said than done, but I think it's more effective, a la Australia, New Zealand, all the successful exporters, to operate in a market when you have a group of people, you have lots of wines there, the trade is more likely to come out, you're going to get more uptake for your product when they have a variety of products. And ultimately just sort of more and continue to have focused, sustained measures to ensure that we are actually recognized as a small but serious wine producer. And that's all for me, so thank you. And if there are any questions?
We've got time for some questions. Janet, I just ask if questions come in over the web, if you could repeat the questions so they get recorded.
Yep.
Actually, I do have one. Currently, producers seem to be focused on what they do rather than what the export market wants from our industry. There appears to be no unified focus as an industry. How do we change this? What have other markets done?
Okay, so producers are more focused on what they do than what the market actually wants. And how do we get producers to be more in line with what's happening in the market? I think in an ideal world, well, two things. In an ideal world, if we had the capacity, like a country like Australia, and had enough product, we could afford to do a lot of market research and testing, and then tailor-made products for that market. But that's never going to happen. We just don't have the size, capacity, or money to do that. So I think what we need to do, and I sort of mentioned it briefly, is that we need to figure out, well, I think we need to really figure out if we're ice wine or table wine or both, or if we are both, what we do with that, because it's confusing. It's confusing to me, and I've been doing this with this industry for 10 years. So, but I think we need to start looking at, for ice wine, we need to start looking at markets where there is the demand, and there's more of a demand, and we need to go after those markets and pursue them more aggressively than we're doing now, and really sort of take an approach like the Champenois have done, or Sauternes, where they, it's all about the product, and it really is rare and special, and then I think we could maybe sell more of those products in those markets.
Janet, I have a question. Knowing this summer that we've got a couple of conferences that are focused on two key white varietals that we think we do very well here in Ontario, Riesling and Chardonnay, how important with the Riesling Experience Conference and the IC4 Chardonnay Conference is that to make sure that we're including and inviting the trade to be able to see firsthand the best of what we do, and also be able to compare that to quality wines on the international market at the same time, to be able to benchmark our wines?
Yeah, I think.
Could you comment on the importance of that kind of strategy to helping to get the information out, not only nationally in Canada, but internationally about what we can do well here in Canada for wine?
Can you also repeat the question, please?
Oh, okay. I guess in a nutshell, it isn't what should we do, and is it important to, through conferences like I4C and the Riesling Experience that will be happening, should we be bringing in trade and influencers to these types of conferences, and what role can they play in sort of, helping us promote these grape varieties? Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think these are the kind of things that we need to be bringing, and we're trying to actually get some of the people who we've brought in before to come back and to see, and especially the ones who are saying, what are we, what do you do? And I think by having more of these kinds of events, and if we bring in people, international trade people, the trade from international places, to these kind of things, I think they'll start to see that, yes, there's always going to be ice wine and people are making ice wine, but there are those few varietals that people have been saying themselves, and I said it in my presentation, Chardonnay and Riesling, that we do really well here, and that we should focus on them, we should celebrate them. So I think it's very important to get the trade in for these kinds of things.
Are there any other questions from the group? Well, with that, Janet, I'd like to thank you for a fantastic presentation today. And I'd like to offer you a small token of our appreciation and ask that everybody join me in a round of applause.
Thank you.
And, sorry, let me just come over to the microphone. I'd also like to announce that our presentation next week is by our own viticulturist, Jim Wilworth, and he's going to be speaking about coming out of the cold, the state of the vine, so some issues regarding cold hardiness for our region. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.